Welcome back, Social 10. We are looking at a new essay prompt here today. And what is the first thing you should always do with an essay source? What's the first thing you should do? Read through it one time, big picture, right? So we read it, it says, let the countries who have found their way into development lead all others. Globalization has the potential to solve the world's problems if only the westernized countries would have the courage to carry the torch. So we read through it once, and then maybe we go back again and we highlight key terms. So my first question then would be, what are some key terms that you believe are essential to unpacking this source? Yes? Okay, so you might highlight this part, globalization has potential. Can I get you to go ahead and highlight that? Oh, you don't have the document open? So let's pick maybe the color green for that. Globalization has the potential. We'll try to figure out what that means in a moment. Any other big rocks, any other essential parts of this source that you think will be key to unpacking it? Westernized countries, so can I get you to highlight that in a different color? Different than green? Yeah, that color will work for us. Anything else that you would have circled on your page? Let the countries who have found their way into development lead all others. Globalization has the potential to solve the world's problems if only the westernized countries would have the courage to carry the torch. Yes? Lead all others? Okay. So maybe highlight that. We'll talk about that then. So the first step is always to read it as, one passage. Read the entirety of it just to get the theme. Second step through is to go through it and try to highlight key terms. Now once we've done this work, we're going to go back and actually write down some stuff with the steps. So step one is to do what? What is the first thing we're meant to do? Yes? Yeah, we're going to try to work towards an ideological perspective for sure. Before we can do that, we have to identify something. What do we have to identify? Yes? What the source is about, right? What's on the page. Before we can talk about, why it's on the page, we need to get to the what's on the page. And when we talk about the what's on the page, what's the what? What's the big thing that we look at through these sources? Before we can get to an ideological perspective, the ideological perspective is about something. What is it going to be about? Yeah, so we're looking for, to what extent is it celebrating or challenging the theme of the course? So the first thing we have to do, step one, is identify the theme. So somebody could type in, step one, identify the theme. Who's going to be our somebody? Who wants to be our somebody? Not 67675, but down here where it says step one, yeah, identify the theme. Thank you. So first step, we need to always identify the theme. So if we're writing this up, we might, our first sentence in our analysis, the source provided gives us a look into the theme of, and then blank, right? The source provided gives us a window or a look into the theme of something. What is the theme of this source? Globalization, right? Globalization is the theme of this. Globalization will be the theme of all sources in Social 10. 20 will be nationalism, 30 will be government and governed. How do we know that this is about globalization? Well, where in it is it mentioning globalization as the theme? Can I get you to highlight with your screen, highlight how we know it's about globalization? Right there, globalization, right? Globalization has the potential, right? So that's the overall arching theme of this source is we're talking about globalization. So early in your analysis paragraph, the first step you're going to do is announce the theme. The source presented provides a window into the theme of globalization. That might be my first sentence in my paragraph, my analysis paragraph. The source presented provides a window into the theme of globalization. More specifically, It does something with globalization. It either celebrates it or it challenges it. Which is it doing here? Yes? Celebrating. So it says it's going to solve the world's problems. So the source provides a window into the theme of globalization, more specifically through the inclusion of the term solve the world's problems. It explicitly, right, through the inclusion of the use of solve the world's problems, it is explicitly celebrating globalization. So, source provides a window into the theme of globalization, more specifically through the inclusion of or the use of to solve the world's problems. It explicitly celebrates globalization. It is explicitly celebrating it. After we've identified the theme and how the source connects to the theme, whether it celebrates or challenges it, what's our next step when we're looking at what's on the page? It's been a few weeks since we've done one of these. The end of the course is near, so this is why we're going back. Yes? Unpack some key terms. We're definitely going to be doing that. That's all we're really doing here is unpacking key terms, right? Every step of this we're going to need to unpack key terms. But once you've identified the theme, we're still talking about what's on the page, we're still talking about key terms, what's the next thing we're looking for? Yeah? Yeah, what is the issue? So here's the theme, but underneath the umbrella that is globalization, that umbrella is huge. It's talking about an issue. It's talking about a problem or challenge or something. Something a little more specific than just globalization. So what is the issue? What is the problem presented? So my question for you will be, what is the issue? What is the problem presented? Yes?
Western countries have the potential to solve the problem to lead others, but they don't.
Okay, so one problem, one nuance of the problem, is that Western countries have a potential that they're not living up to. Let's keep that idea, to the side for a second. We're going to come back to that. Let's say the Edmonton Oilers want to win the Stanley Cup, and they have the potential to win the Stanley Cup. If only they had the courage to do something, they would win the Stanley Cup. So you can see how it connects, right? That it's an obstacle in the way. The lack of courage could be seen as an obstacle in the way of overcoming the problem. And sometimes the obstacle becomes the problem. But let's read it through again. Let the countries who have found their way into development lead all others. Globalization has the potential to solve the world's problems, if only the westernized countries would have the courage to carry the torch. So you're certainly right that this lack of courage from the Western countries is an obstacle, and in and of itself that is a problem. But ultimately, underneath the idea that the source is celebrating globalization, it's celebrating it to do what? Yes?
It offers globalization as a solution to inequality.
Yeah, it offers globalization as a solution to, now you said disparity and inequality, those words aren't there. What words are there? World's problems. So what is the problem that the source is responding to? Literally, the problem is the world's problems. That's the problem. That's the issue in globalization. The issue within globalization is that there's problems. That's the issue. The issue is that globalization has problems. Now the obstacle, why aren't we addressing the problems? The obstacle is that the Western countries maybe lack the courage to address the problems. But the problem is this term world problems. So far we have a paragraph that might look like this. The source presents, or the source provided gives us an insight into the theme of globalization. More specifically, by suggesting that it can solve the world's problems, or by explicitly stating it solves the world problems, we can determine that it celebrates globalization. But there still are world problems. The issues within the source are these world problems. Now, the language of world problems is quite vague, isn't it? So we might say that although the source announces that globalization is challenged by world problems, it's very vague in describing what these problems are. But we can infer that the source would include these things as the world problems. So, first sentence, the source presents insight into the theme of globalization. Second sentence, more specifically, the inclusion of the phrase, globalization has the potential to solve the world's problems. It is explicitly celebrating globalization. Within the source, they use the term world's problems as the issue. This is literally the problem of globalization. Unfortunately, that language is quite vague. So it leaves the reader the necessity to infer what that phrase implies. So our next step, just going to get rid of that space there. Boop. Our next step is going to be to, now that we've announced that the problem is world problems, although the problem is stated in a very vague or general way, we can infer that it's referring to these things. And you already said some of them. You said disparity and poverty. Anything else that it could be referring to? Disparity, poverty, world hunger. So now we have to think back to the course that we've had and all of the challenges within globalization, all the flaws within globalization. Disparity, poverty, world hunger. So far you're thinking along the lines of Maslow and his physiological needs, right? Climate change. So that's the externality of our economic activities. That's the sustainability, the viability of globalization based upon our ecological footprints, the externality, the unintended consequences of our actions. What else have we talked about that has looked at the problem side of globalization? Sorry? Exploitation, right? So we've done a unit on human rights and exploitation, whether it's transnationals exploiting workers, or sometimes we talk about exploitation historically based upon gender or ethnicity. So, although the source states the problem to be literally world's problems, it's quite vague in its description of them. But we can infer that the source is implying these things: poverty, disparity, hunger, the exploitation of others, climate change. So first thing we've done is identified the theme, but we've also identified the problem. And a potential obstacle. The obstacle being the Western countries lack the courage to provide leadership. Now, once we've kind of discussed what's there, now we can get to the next step. And the next step is, most important step perhaps, the ideological perspective that's going to include the solution. Absolutely. The solution is the perspective, right? This is their perspective about the problem. This is their solution for it. So step 2 is to describe, announce, unpack the ideological perspective. So again, going back, we've already announced that the ideological perspective connected to the theme is pro-globalization. So we've already began some work on this. These steps are not independent of each other. There's overlap. So we've already announced that the source is pro-globalization. We've already announced that it's the perspective of the source, that there's an obstacle in the way though. And that is that perhaps Western countries lack the courage, right? So we've already began this process of identifying the ideological perspective. Any other words there that really help us understand that the source isn't 100% sure that globalization will be the cure? Yes? Yeah, so when the source says globalization has potential, that's the perspective that, although it's pro-globalization, that it's not a guaranteed solution. That, again, there's an obstacle in the way, and that's the lack of leadership from the West. So although the source does provide globalization as a solution, it's not a definite solution. The inclusion of the term has the potential announces that globalization may not address these issues. And it may not because of the obstacle. The obstacle is getting in our way, and the obstacle is lack of courage. Before we move on, any questions so far? We have a theme, globalization. We have a problem, world's problems. And that world problems is very vague, right? So we had to unpack that, and that's poverty, that's disparity, that's climate change. But we also have an obstacle connected to the problem. An obstacle that is so large that it becomes another problem. And that is the lack of courage shown by Western countries. Now, through this, we can unpack the perspective of the source. It's presenting globalization as a solution to the world's problems. But it's not a definite. It's a potential solution. And again, the obstacle is the perhaps Western countries lacking the courage. That's where we're at so far. Any questions yet? So now we're going to look at some of the other key language. So when it says, if only the Western countries would have the courage to carry the torch, can we infer that Western countries are carrying the torch now, or they're not? Are they doing it now? No. If only you guys would read the textbook at night. If only you'd review these videos. It's suggesting that you're not doing it. So when the source says, if only this, then it's telling us that we have this obstacle in the way. That's why it's not solving the problems. So who's the audience then? When it says, if only the Western countries would have the courage to carry the torch, who's the audience there? Who are they speaking to? Darnell Nurse. If only Darnell Nurse would play physical, but within the parameters of the legality of the game and not headbutt people. They're talking to the Western countries. If only the Western countries would have the courage to carry the torch, the audience is the Western countries. The intended response is what? What does the speaker want from Western countries? They want them to carry the torch, right? So within that sentence, we can find the audience and the intended response. If only the Western countries would have the courage to carry the torch, this obstacle, right? This is our obstacle right now. Well, your audience is the Western countries. Unless you're talking about Western countries behind their back, then you're not really going to resolve the problem. So this could be non-Western countries just complaining to each other about how the world is broken, and it's going to remain broken because the West has a lack of interest. They're so apathetic to the world challenges. But if they really want to solve this, they really want to see Western countries have their full potential, then the audience is the Western countries. Now, you guys highlighted Western countries in blue there, and I appreciate that. Why is it important to unpack the term Western countries? Well, we need to know who the audience is, but they're also presenting the Western countries as a part of what? The solution. So it's going to be important to understand, what does the source mean by Western countries, right? In order to actually respond to this source, we're going to have to figure out, what do they mean by Western countries? So we don't know. We don't know what they mean by Western countries because that's all that they give us. But what can we infer that they mean? What does generally the term Western mean? Western is usually, maybe Western Hemisphere. Western Hemisphere, though, that's the Arctic to the Antarctic. That's the polar bears to the penguins. That's not usually what we mean by the Western Hemisphere. What else is usually included in the Western Hemisphere? So we have North America and Western Europe, NATO, if you will. That's the Western Hemisphere. So when they're saying Western countries, they're talking about the United Kingdom, United States, talking about Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, really talking about like the G7 to some extent, the majority of the members of the G7. We're talking about those, what qualities do they have? Well, they're democracies. They're also capitalist countries. What else can we deduce about these Western countries that the source is suggesting? What do they share? It's in the first sentence. That they have first found their way into globalization, right? Let the countries who have found their way into development lead all others, if only the Western countries would have the courage. So when it says, let the countries who've found their way, they're talking about the Western countries. We just don't use the term Western countries in both. It could say, let the Western countries lead all others. Globalization has potential to solve the world's problems if only the Western countries did something. But they don't want to use the term Western countries twice. But we can connect a term, let the countries who have found their way into globalization lead all others, as the idea of Western countries. So we're going to continue that thought. Before we continue that thought, though, why might the United States say, well, you know what, time out here. Time out. I don't like the focus on Western, yes? Maybe their ego gets hurt. Sometimes the United States likes the spotlight to be on them, right? Why would the United States and United States' allies in the Western Hemisphere, like Canada, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, say, wait a minute, this isn't going to happen? Yes?
Because they use the developing countries as like exploit their workers in exchange.
Yeah, so that's definitely going to be a nuance, especially of that first sentence. So think of climate change. Think of Kyoto. Kyoto Protocol is no more. We've moved beyond Kyoto. But when we talked about climate change, the United States was one of the countries that didn't want to sign on because not all countries would be treated equally underneath it. Some countries, developing countries, had less obligations than developed countries. So Canada might look at that and it says, let the Western countries have the courage to carry the torch, and Canada might be like, wait a minute, what about these countries? Should they carry the torch? Who would Canada point and say, what about these guys? Who are these guys? Who's Canada pointing a finger and saying, what about them? Who's the them? Sorry? Nigeria, maybe. Nigeria, in terms of an African sense, probably should carry some torch. Who else should carry a torch in 2022? 2022, we're talking about the world's problems and countries with the ability to fix it. Italy and Spain might be like, why are you talking to me? You need to talk to the US, China, India. China has 1.4 billion people. India has 1.4 billion people. Canada has 38 million. Why are we solving the world's problems? So we might look at China and say, China has the second largest economy in the world. Japan has the third largest economy in the world. India's economy is one of the most rapidly increasing. Gone are the days when the world's problems are just solved by Europe and America. If we are going to really address the world's problems, we have to stop looking at just the West. So when we talk about the division of society surrounding some of the language use, there might be people within the West, within that audience, that would respond and say, this is an unfair attack on the United States and her allies, and it's ignoring the responsibility of China, Japan, Indonesia, countries that have economies also in the top 2 and 3 and 10 in the world. That's putting too much responsibility on countries like Canada. So it's maybe an overstatement of the global significance of the Western countries, and therefore there could be an anti-Western bias here. What's a word that's being used to manipulate the West into acting? Is there a word there that's like, you know what, this is how I'm going to try to manipulate you into acting? Courage, right? If only you had the courage. Well, people want to be recognized as having courage. So the voice behind the source is using the word courage to manipulate the Western nations into a call to action to solve the world's problems that some of these Western countries might be fairly insignificant in causing, or fairly insignificant in being able to fix. So that's a part of the division of society. So we have unpacked the ideological perspective, but we also have this idea of division of society. You know, would everybody agree with the perspective of the source? You know, what language within the source might create a point of frustration or controversy or divergence in opinion? But let's go back to what you guys had connected before. You know, if only the Western countries would have the courage to carry the torch. Up top it says, let the countries who found their way into the development lead all others. Who found their way? Western countries. So what does it mean? What does that first sentence even mean? We need to spend more time on that. Let the countries, these Western countries who found their way into development lead all others. What does that mean, found their way into development? The United States found their way into development. Canada found their way. England found their way. What is a potential point of controversy or diversion in that language, found your way? Let the UK, who found their way into development. Let Belgium, who found its way into development. How did the Belgian nation find its way into development? What did the Belgian people do this year? What did we study? We haven't studied the Belgian people often. When did they come up? What did they do? Yes? They exploited the Congo. King Leopold in the Congo. He committed a genocide. 10 million Congolese people died as they extracted rubber for the wealth of the royal family of Belgium, King Leopold II. So, when the source says, let the countries who have found their way, you know, found their way seems to be ignoring the burden that Western countries placed upon others in order to find their way. So, Belgium found its way. It's ignoring the burden that the Congolese people had UK found their way, it's ignoring the burden that who had? Who had the burden for the British? India, with mercantilism. What's another area of the world that had a burden for the British Empire, or within the British Empire? Who had the burden for the English finding their way through the Industrial Revolution? Slaves, yeah. So the English, some of the colonies used slaves. Definitely slaves were burdened with the Americans finding their way, right? Let the countries who found their way into development. Well, America didn't just find its way. It developed by exploiting, by passing the burden on to slaves. So when you're thinking about how you want to respond to the essay, you might want to respond to the idea of found their way. You know, it's not as simple as just like, oh, we read a book and there was the answer. What's the answer here? Slavery. The answer is, let's sell drugs to the Chinese. Oh, it says here we should cut off the hands of the Congolese people. It says here we're going to create a mercantilist system with the Indian people where we tax them to the point of mass starvation. That there'll be millions dying in India and Bangladesh because of our colonial policies. We found our way. So the source's use of the term found their way is forgetting. It's overlooking, all of this imperialism and the burden that had been passed upon the developing world. And if the source actually acknowledged that, then maybe it would be more than just if only the Western countries had the courage to carry the torch. It might be a little more demanding and be like, you guys really took advantage of these developing countries. Now you owe it to them. It's not an issue of you have the courage to do it. You bloody well owe them because of the legacy of what you've done to them. You're only rich now because you plundered them. So now it's your turn to help them. That would have been a different tone. But it would have been a tone that may have been fitting based upon what we've done in the course. So we have identified the theme, unpacked the ideological perspective, talk about some division of society. Not everyone agrees with this. Americans are like, why are we fixing it? Why not the Chinese? Their carbon footprint is way worse than ours. But we also have the complexity of some of the language use that is overlooking some of the history here. What's the last thing that we need to look at when we're unpacking a source? Thought your hand was up for a second. Yeah? We're getting close to that, yeah. So before we get to our thesis statement, something else we have to talk about what's being presented to us. We analyze what's there, then we respond to it. But before we can respond to it, we want to show that something. So we've unpacked the key language. We've identified a theme and a problem, some obstacles. We've talked about, while we unpacked the ideological perspective, we found some bias, some assumptions, some things that maybe they overlooked, like that burden part. We talked about a division of society that was surrounded about that. We looked at how America might be offended by it, but this is a Chinese, Japanese, this is a global problem. It's not just an American problem. So we talked about that division of society there. But before we say this is how we solve the problem, what do we need to do? One last, and it's not a huge step that you guys are forgetting. Yes? Yes. Before we say this is how we solve the problem, we have to say this is why we have to solve the problem. Right? And again, sometimes maybe the significance of the problem, maybe that sentence is earlier in your analysis paragraph. But we want to talk about the significance. We want to talk about, if left unaddressed, the problem that is expressed within the source could lead to something. So let's look at the problem. The problem are the world's problems. We said the world's problems are poverty and disparity and climate change. You could add to that deforestation and desertification. You could add to that animal habitat destruction, mass extinction. If left unaddressed, how bad would this get? What's the worst case scenario for the planet if we don't solve our problems? You tell me. So what's a phrase that we've collected this year? Death of birth. If left unaddressed, the problem that is central to the source could lead to the death of birth. Where, all the living things within the biosphere can no longer be sustained as a consequence of our global actions. That provides urgency, right? And then after that, it's a logical transition into this is what I think the solution is. So there's your analysis of the source. Now, when you think about your thesis statement, you might say, you know what? Although, this is the part I agree with, but you forgot this, therefore we need to do this. Although, you're right when you said this, but you're wrong, or you forgot to say this, therefore we should really be doing this. That's your thesis statement, right? So, can you think of any although, but, therefores before we hit Control End on this video and be done with this tutorial for the day? What is a possible thesis statement? How would you possibly respond? What's the part that you might respond? You might say, although, you know what? You're right. Although, what do you agree with about the source? I feel like getting out of my chair, but then nobody's going to see me, right? Although, what do we agree about with this source? So let the countries who have found their way to development lead all others. Globalization has potential to solve the world's problems if only the westernized countries would have the courage to carry the torch. Although, every one of us should be able to agree about one thing that source is claiming is true. Now, we might not agree about everything that means, but we'll agree that that part is true. Now, how we unpack that, we might disagree. But what is something within that source everybody agrees? Globalization maybe has potential. There are people deglobalizing right now, so some of them might be a little less pro-globalization than you might be. At this point of the course, everyone should agree that, well, it's kind of central to the source. It's kind of central to the source. So, in terms of your thesis statement is your solution to the problem. What's the problem? World problems. And everybody would agree the world has some problems. We may disagree on what those problems are. Somebody might say climate change is a problem. Some people might be like, no, it's not. This is all natural. It's not made by man. But those who might say climate change isn't a problem, maybe they see a different problem. Poverty. Or lack of clean water, lack of clean air, animal extinction. People see problems in the world village. So although the world has problems, and you can even add an and if you want, right? Although the world has problems, and some of them were caused by, the way Western countries found their way. You can even add that, right? Although the world has problems, and some of them were caused by the manner in which or the way Western countries found their way, what's the but? The but is this part, right? The but is talking about the bias around this. On their own, what? On their own, these Western countries cannot solve the problems. Although the world has problems, and some of them can be traced to the manner in which these Western countries found their way, on their own, they are unlikely to solve the problems. And then, in order to solve the problems, what do we need? What do we need? Well, we need China, Japan, Indonesia, Nigeria. We need the Philippines. We need the Philippines because 10% of the plastic in the world's oceans are coming from one country, and it's the Philippines. Canada can stop putting plastics and microplastics in our rivers. We're not going to solve that problem on our own. In order to solve the problem, we need what? Global cooperation, right? And you're right, maybe the global cooperation is under the banner of Western leadership. But we need everybody on board. You don't have to use that as a thesis. We just made one together there so that you can see what kinds of statements you can make. You can respond to this by saying, the idea that the world has problems has been exaggerated to perpetuate some kind of, leftist, agenda to have big state control our human liberties. That would be a really interesting essay to read. That'd be quite a conspiracy theorist rant. But we developed a thesis statement there that you could work on. You know what? I could probably give you the rest of the class today to tidy up your analysis paragraph, tidy up your thesis statement, and then share your analysis paragraphs with me when they look good. On Monday, we'll do some of the human rights things to finish that up. On Monday, we'll talk about the wave 3 and 4 of women's rights movement. And on Monday, we'll look at what would motivate you to action. So we'll do some of the stuff that was in our Google Classroom today. We'll actually push that till Monday. But being that you're thinking about this now, let's get you to finish this up.